Welcome to Season 6 of Far Reach Voyages, where we share our love of offshore sailing and adventure travel. Have you ever wanted to sail offshore from the U.S. East Coast to the Virgin Islands, St. Martin, or the other islands of the Eastern Caribbean, but the idea of the long offshore voyage was just too intimidating or just seems too complicated? It doesn't have to be. And it doesn't take a lot of expensive, specialized equipment to do it either. If this is something you want to know more about, then stick around. You might find this episode of Far Reach Voyages interesting and useful. Several viewers have asked how I plan for a single-handed offshore voyage. Most of the planning considerations are the same if you're single-handing or you're crewed. I've done both. So let's dive into it. I don't profess to be an expert, and I won't tell you how to do it on your own boat. But I'll share how I've done it and what my thinking and planning steps are to make it as safe and practicable and with as little drama as possible. This video will take a look at the voyage from North Carolina on the U.S. East Coast to the Virgin Islands. I've made this trip 3 times, once double-handed with my sister Tricia, and twice single-handed. All 3 voyages were trouble-free for the crew and the Far Reach. I look at this voyage as having 3 distinct parts. The first part's about 125 nautical miles long, from Cape Lookout across the Gulf Stream to the eastern edge of the continental shelf and the 12,000-foot drop-off to the American Basin. The second part is about 800 miles long and takes me out to 26 degrees north, 63 degrees west. The third part is the run south to the Virgin Islands and is about 500 miles long. Throw in some contrary headwinds and a few tacks, and the voyage runs about 1,500 to 1,600 nautical miles overall. The voyage from the U.S. East Coast to the Virgin Islands is an early winter, generally upwind passage. I make this voyage at the end of hurricane season. This graph depicts the number of hurricanes in the Atlantic in any given year. Hurricane season officially runs from 1 June to 30 November. Though some sailors suggest October is a good time for departure, I don't agree. I don't consider making the voyage before the middle of November, when hurricane season is just about over. My decision process is predicated on the view that as long as there's nothing brewing in the Atlantic from the U.S. to the west coast of Africa, then I want to be ready to make the first weather window across the Gulf Stream after November 15th. I also think it's better to go before the middle of December when possible, due to the onset of the North Atlantic winter storm season. The further north your departure point, the sooner the window closes out as the winter gales arrive. More on this when we talk about the pilot charts. The upwind voyage to the Virgin Islands in November-December is not as leisurely as the voyage home in May, which is mostly downwind in light to moderate conditions and very pleasant. Despite the more rugged aspect of the voyage to the Virgin Islands, the winds, however, can sometimes be quite light. During my first voyage, my sister and I were becalmed several times for a total of nearly 3 days. On all 3 voyages, I've been becalmed at least once and usually a couple of times. Despite what some people think, I've always found being becalmed a magical time. Being becalmed at sea with its unique rhythms and unbelievable solitude can really bond you to the sailors of the past, before there were auxiliary engines and sailboats. It can be a profound spiritual experience. Well, for me anyway. Sadly, it seems most people motor through the calms, always in a hurry to get where they're going. The crew have airplanes to catch, I guess. But if you're single-handing or sailing with your significant other, then you own your own schedule. I remind myself to relax and sail with the wind I have and take what comes. The last third of the voyage between the U.S. East Coast and the islands is generally going to be boisterous sailing with a fair amount of motion. This is because you'll have picked up the easterly trade winds around 24 north, and because you're heading south, you'll be beam reaching. If you made enough easting early on in the voyage, then as you get deeper into the often reinforced December trades, often called the Christmas winds, you can foot off to the southwest on a broad reach, then you'll be reasonably comfortable. But if you foot off too soon and the wind goes more southeast, those last 200 miles or so can be mighty difficult. On my first voyage, Trish and I sailed the last 5 days, close reaching, in winds 25 knots, gusting 35 knots, in 10 to 12 foot seas. It was not fun. So my strategy for the first 2/3 of the voyage is to go as far east as I can and avoid the temptation to turn south too soon. This particular voyage is usually about 12 days long for a boat like mine, though my first voyage took 17 days. The benefit for going offshore is it completely avoids the monotonous motoring in the ICW and the shenanigans that go with it as you travel towards Florida with a caravan of sailboats making only about 50 miles a day. Going offshore, there's no worry about getting low on fuel because you're sailing. You don't have to worry about finding an anchorage either before dark because you're sailing all night. The best part of this approach is if you want to visit the Bahamas, you can do it on the return trip when the sailing is often downwind, and when you exit the northern Bahamas, you'll be sailing north in the early summer southerly winds and riding the Gulf Stream as well. It's a win-win. Though the offshore route comes with some anxiety, remember, in the end, it's just sailing. And if you're a reasonably competent sailor who can comfortably and safely sail upwind, downwind, tack, jibe, and reef your sails day or night, and if your boat's put together properly and tough enough for moderate conditions you'll experience, you can make the voyage. How comfortable you'll be is a function of the boat's design, its construction and condition, your physiological response to the motion, and your skill and judgment sailing her. Let me talk for a few minutes about my boat, so you know what my experience is based on. The Far Reach is a highly modified 1982 Cape Dory 36 full kill, tiller steered cutter rig boat. All my self-steering is done with a Windvane. I rebuilt my boat from a bare hull and in the process made her very strong. She also has a bigger rig with more sail area than a stock boat, but even a heavy, somewhat under canvas boat will perform well enough as there's generally plenty of wind on this voyage. She's watertight. There are no leaking decks, port lights, or hatches, so we're generally comfortable offshore. I keep the decks clear so I can move around on deck without having to avoid unnecessary obstacles. She's easy to reef, and I'm comfortable doing it day or night. All the halyards and reefing systems are at the mast. This reduces line friction, means there's less to go wrong, and it helps keep the cockpit clear of excessive lines. Because I'm familiar with the entire deck, when I have to go forward at night, it's nothing to get excited about. I can easily make 145 to 150 miles a day, and that includes reefing at night, which of course slows the boat down. But for planning purposes, I typically plan for about 130 miles a day over the course of a voyage, which allows for light wind and being becalmed. In general, she's a fairly simple, uncomplicated boat. I don't have a chart plotter, radar, electric autopilot, water maker, refrigerator, wind generator, electric windlass, or lithium battery pack. And until the third voyage, I didn't even have an engine. So you don't need to spend the many thousands of dollars on equipment the experts tell you have to have. By all means, if you want that stuff and you feel it adds to your enjoyment, then go for it. But it's not necessary. What is necessary is a strong boat, well put together, reasonable sailing skill, confidence, and good judgment. You're not going to set yourself up for a successful offshore voyage by watching YouTube or hoping everything will turn out well. Hope isn't a course of action. You need to do your homework, which for me means reading books written by seasoned offshore sailors and gathering information presented in primary sources of information. Here's how I do it. Pilot charts depict separate oceans of the world and breaks them into 5-degree squares. These are my pilot charts for the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean. There's a separate chart for each month. There's a wind rose in every 5-degree square depicting the percentage of wind direction and its velocity. In the center of the circle is the percentage of calms. The green arrows are ocean currents and its average velocity. Red lines depict percentage of waves over 10 feet. There's also a pictorial representation of the number of gales in each 5-degree square for that month. All this data, empirical and quantitative, has been gathered over hundreds of years by sailors and scientists. Studying these charts is revealing and inspires a lot of confidence because it informs your decision making. Ocean Passages for the World. First published in 1895, this is one of my favorite resources. It covers all the oceans of the world. My copy is a third edition and was printed in 1973 and published by the Hydrographic Department of the British Admiralty. Earlier editions contained more info on sailing than later editions. OPW contains separate info based on decades of observation for both power and sailing ships. It also includes 8 separate fold-out maps of the world depicting ocean currents, ship routes, and major climate considerations. There are many other sources you can use to flesh out the details. Jimmy Cornell's World Cruising Routes is a useful resource, though it mostly distills info found in other sources into a single, easy-to-read reference book. Don Street. No one's written more about crossing the Atlantic both ways than Don Street. I found his 1979 book, Seawise, very helpful to me as I planned my first voyage to the Caribbean. Publication 110, List of Lights, covers the entire U.S. East Coast and the West Indies. This pub contains all major fixed and outermost floating aids to navigation. When you're making landfall and you see a 4-second white flashing light off your port bow, this pub's going to help you identify it so you know you're in the right place. Pub 147, Sailing Directions, provides details about approaches to islands and their harbors, as well as obstructions, currents, and man-made features. U.S. Coastal Pilots provides details about environmental factors, currents and tides, hazards, prominent landmarks, vertical clearances, etc. This easy-to-use pub is designed to be used as a supplement to nautical charts. You don't find this information on digital charts. All U.S. government publishings can be downloaded for free by going to nauticalcharts.noaa.gov. There is no one best route for all sailors and all boats. What's a good choice for a 60-foot boat with an experienced 6-man crew may not be the best route for a single-hander or 2-man crew on their first voyage to the Caribbean. Every route has its pros and cons. Whatever route gets you there safely with the least drama is a good route. First and foremost, you have to know your boat and yourself. But in general, there are essentially 4 main routes to the Virgin Islands from the East Coast. I'll call them routes 1, 2, 3, and 4. Route 1 from New England, stopping in or passing near Bermuda. Route 2 from the Chesapeake Bay, passing west of Bermuda. Route 3 from Beaufort, North Carolina. And Route 4 from Charleston and Point South via Florida and the Bahamas, known as the Thorny Path. But wait, it's not that simple. There's the Gulf Stream, that magnificent, powerful, fast-moving, warm water current which runs up the east coast of the U.S. all the way to the British Isles. It's narrowest off southern Florida, and then spreads out as it crosses the shallow Outer Banks of North Carolina. As it moves further north, it develops many meandering eddies that have caused sailors great difficulties and danger since ships first sailed these waters. You don't want to be in the Gulf Stream with an opposing, stiff, northerly component breeze, as the seas can become very dangerous. Another factor, and something which doesn't get a lot of attention, but the pilot charts support, is an area between Bermuda and the East Coast that has an uncommon high frequency of late-season hurricanes and subtropical gales. These storms can be quite dangerous, as they almost always have a north wind component to them, which can be deadly in the north-flowing Gulf Stream. Here's a look at the pilot charts depicting historical gales from September through December. You can see as November-December approaches, it's much safer to take your departure further south. Departing from New England offers the best point of sail. You have a good chance of sailing off the wind or a reach the whole way. Overall, it's about 1,500 nautical miles long. But it's a long way to get across the Gulf Stream And a north component wind for downwind sailing means trouble in the meandering current. Because it's so far north, you have smaller weather window to get clear of deeper low pressure systems arriving along the Atlantic coast. And you have to sail almost 800 miles to get clear of the areas dominated by the increasing number of November and December gales. An option is to work your way down the coast into the Chesapeake Bay and use that as your point of departure. Route 2 is also about 1,500 miles long. The wind angle is not as good as it is from New England, so there's usually going to be some upwind work until you pick up the trades. While the Chesapeake is further south in New England, the Gulf Stream is still a couple of hundred miles offshore, so it takes a good weather window to cross it safely. You also have to sail right through the area of late season storms described earlier. This route also puts the dangerous Outer Banks of North Carolina, the graveyard of the Atlantic, as a lee shore. And if you have trouble, there's no decent port of refuge until you get to Beaufort or Wilmington, North Carolina. By November, winter is already beginning to show itself along the mid-Atlantic coast of the U.S. If your mast height's less than 65 feet, then an option is to take the ICW down to Beaufort, North Carolina and take your departure from there. Or if you don't want to motor the ICW, it's about 220 miles from Norfolk around Cape Hatteras to Beaufort, which is a fine sail in settled weather. I've done it twice and had a great sail both times. Route 3 provides the shortest distance between the East Coast and the Virgin Islands at about 1,400 nautical miles. However, it has the tightest wind angle of the first three routes, so you can expect more upwind sailing or at least close reaching. But the Gulf Stream is only 60 miles wide off Beaufort, the narrowest anywhere along the East Coast except between Florida and the Bahamas. But best of all, the east wall of the Gulf Stream is only about 100 miles from Beaufort. You can be across it in 18 to 24 hours. In 300 miles, you're beyond the area of November gales. You can get a very reliable weather window for that small amount of time. There are also less low pressure systems here in November or even early December because your departure point is further south. You'll also skirt the troublesome area for late season gales between Bermuda and the U.S. East Coast. And you start the voyage south of the dangerous Outer Banks, so it's not a concern. Route 4 is the longest of the four at about 1,600 miles, but that's not the hard part. From Charleston, South Carolina to Point South, the wind angle to the Virgin Islands is very poor. It's a lot of upwind work, most of it in the trades. You'll also have to cross the shallow and wide Blake Plateau before you get to the safety of deep offshore water. Once you get much further south in Wilmington, North Carolina, then the thorny path through the Bahamas begins to make more sense. There is, of course, a lot to be said for sailing through the Bahamas with perhaps an opportunity to explore the Dominican Republic and even Puerto Rico. There are not many places you can sail safely at night in the Bahamas, so your ability to cover a lot of distance in a short amount of time is dramatically reduced. In short, this route takes a lot more time than the first three routes discussed. When you get into the southern Bahamas, you're looking at an ugly upwind bash through the trades to get to the eastern Caribbean. You may have to wait weeks to get winds reasonable enough for dead upwind sailing required to get to the Virgin Islands. But if you're simply not ready to do a lot of offshore work, or shipping your boat, or hiring a delivery crew, then this is the only way to get to the Virgin Islands. I want my boat ready to go by 1 November. So I start discussing the Gulf Stream crossing with Chris Parker at marineweather.com in early November. My first priority is to get a good weather window to get across the Gulf Stream and a couple hundred miles of offing as quick as I can. The winds need to be west to southeast crossing the Gulf Stream so they don't oppose the 3-knot northeast current. When the conditions are right, I go. At this time of year, the weather starts changing rapidly and the windows can be small, so I have to be ready. I remind myself of the old mariner's adage, wind and tide wait for no man. Once I depart, though, I can only receive Parker's weather info as I don't have a transmit capability on my portable single sideband radio. Then I focus on part 2, which is usually upwind as I can comfortably sail, making as much easting as possible. My aim point's generally about 26 degrees north, 63 degrees west. Pretty sporty conditions, close reach. Wind's about 20, gusting 25. Got a double reef main and a working jib. And see how she holds up to this. May have to go to a staysail. We're making 6 knots. Cape Horn Windvane. Once I get there, then I start part 3 and head south-southeast, usually on a reach until I pick up the trades and carry on south to southwest to arrive in the Virgin Islands. We're about 500 miles, nautical miles, northwest of the British Virgin Islands. So we've come about 800 miles. Wind's about 20, maybe gust to 25. We've got a long slog on this tack in these conditions. We're close reaching under staysail, the double reef main. Because I have a taller rig and a longer bowsprit, I only need 100% jib, which is the same sail area as a 130 on a stock Cape Dory 36. A non-overlapping jib is faster and easier to tack than 130% Genoa, which is important when shorthand sailing. I have jiffy reefing on the main with 2 reef points. All the reefing is done at the mast. The staysail has 2 reef points. The forestay is synthetic Caligo Dynex ducks with the staysail bent on via 3/4 inch brass luff rings. When the staysail is not employed, it's bagged, still on the duck's forestay, and stowed near the mast, which makes tacking simple and efficient. I tension the forestay with a Dyneema pendant to the rope drum on the windlass. It's fast, simple, and strong. I employ 1-to-1 Dyneema runners, which I tension via the lazy secondary sheet winch on the windward side of the boat. 4-to-1 runners are ineffective as you can't tension them enough to counteract the forestay. If the runner is led to a winch, the 4-to-1 is unnecessary and saves you all that extra line. Nothing's faster than 1-to-1. The trysail is pre-rigged on a separate track on the starboard side of the mast and stowed on deck in its own bag. The sheets are pre-rigged to the sail. For my first 2 voyages, I carried a Spot Gen 3 as my primary means of communicating with the outside world. It uses the Global Star satellite network. The Spot can only send a satellite GPS coordinate or simple pre-typed text. It can't receive text or emails. I kind of liked it only worked one way. I didn't want the distraction, complexity, or expense of 2-way comms. It proved to be unreliable. I sent my lat long twice a day to my family and Chris Parker at marineweather.com. Chris would plot my position, then during his morning and evening weather broadcast would transmit a weather forecast to me in the blind, which I would listen to on my portable single sideband receiver. Sometimes those on the other end, like Chris Parker, who needed my position to forecast the weather every day, wouldn't receive my lat long for hours. For my 3rd voyage, I replaced it with the Garmin inReach Mini, which uses the Iridium satellite system. The inReach is 2-way texting. It works flawlessly. The only single sideband radio I carry is a receive-only Sony SW7600GR portable. I connect it to a DIY in-fed long wire antenna I hoist up the backstay. It's worked pretty well. I listen to Parker's weather forecast twice a day on it. I can even download weather faxes with it. I like using it. It's fun, it's rewarding, and it's pretty reliable. I also have a standalone Vesper Watchmate 850 AIS Class B transponder. It uses very little power. I have it plugged into an external GPS antenna to improve its performance. It also has a GPS display. I use a Garmin GPS 78 SC to record a 0600 and 1800 lat long position, which I plot on paper passage chart. This continues to be my primary means of navigation. I also have iNavix on the iPad mini. It doesn't do much for me at sea. I carry several hundred paper charts and I always plot on paper. I'm competent with celestial navigation, both sun, line of position, and star fix. This is a skill I continue to work on and desire to use it as my primary means of navigation as my ability to quickly reduce the sights improves. I use HO249. In 2024, you don't need to know celestial. You can carry a backup GPS. But I will say this, a lot of offshore sailing is confidence. Knowing I can lose all my electronics and still navigate just as well with a sextant and paper reduction tables, an almanac, and a wind-up chronometer gives me a lot of confidence. It takes the worry away about losing all your electronics if the boat gets hit by lightning or the global GPS system gets shut down. Competence and confidence are priceless. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Sleep. Even though I'm single-handed, I sleep whenever I can, as much as I can. You simply can't function well without adequate sleep, and you really need as much uninterrupted sleep as you can get.
I slept for about an hour this morning just on the cabin sole. I was in my foul weather pants and I didn't want to take them off and put my harness on. I just laid down on walnut cabin sole.
I use an AIS that receives as well as transmits. I set my AIS alarm to alert me if a ship is within 6 nautical miles and will pass within 3 miles of me. Otherwise, I don't care if there are ships 5 miles away. They don't affect me. Like self-steering, AIS is a huge help to single-handers. However, even with AIS, if I have crew on board, then we stand watch. There's simply no substitute for the Mark I eyeball. It's very unlikely you're going to get run down offshore. The real danger is when you're close to the coast or crossing shipping lanes. I don't sleep much for either of those scenarios. In fact, when close to the coast or any time I think it's necessary, I set my timer to wake me up every 20 minutes. I get up, I scan the horizon, I crawl back into my bunk and reset the timer for 20 minutes. It's exhausting, no doubt about it. But sometimes that's what you have to do and why it's important to get as much sleep as possible when you can. My philosophy is big ocean, little boat. Rule number 1 is stay on the boat. Rule number 2 is see rule number 1. This is one of those topics that gets sailors and non-sailors really worked up. I'm not going to tell anyone else what to do. I don't want to encourage anyone else's decision process on this. You have to do what you think's right for you and your crew. My view is safety is not something you wear. It's not something bolted to the deck. Safety is what's between your ears. I look at a harness as a rough weather harness. I wear it when I think the conditions warrant it. What I've found works best for me is to position 6-foot tethers at the bow, the mast, and the cockpit. When I wear a harness, I carefully move from tether to tether. I almost always have a harness on at night. This works best for me on how I view risk. As a career infantry and reconnaissance marine, I spent most of my adult life doing dangerous activities. My view of acceptable risk is going to be different than someone else's. You have to do what you think's right for you. I put in a lot of effort to make my boat safer. I have 6 3/4 inch tall bulwarks, and the stanchions are 30 inches tall versus the standard 24 inches tall. I don't have a full Dodger or Bimini, so I have unobstructed visibility. And so it's quick and easy to leave and re-enter the cockpit. I don't have any water or fuel cans on deck to trip over or snag lines in the middle of the night. Having said that, I do have a 1/2 inch line rigged from the boom gallows frame through the dinghy chocks to the mast and back to the gallows frame on the other side of the boat. I can use it as a jack line if I feel it's necessary. All this works for me. However, if my daughter was making a passage with me, then you can bet she and I'll both have a harness on pretty much all the time. In other words, I'm willing to take more risk when I'm only responsible for me than when I'm responsible for family or crew. Funny how our decision process works. Bottom line, do what you think's right for you. But the world ends at the edge of the deck. So stay on the boat however you decide to do it. After 3 voyages to the West Indies, we have a pretty good feel on how to provision the boat for us. Provisions are less expensive in the U.S. than in the islands, so we essentially provision for 6 months minus perishables. When I rebuilt the Far Reach, I created a lot more interior storage space, which was a high priority for us. In preparation for the first offshore voyage, I made a diagram of the boat and numbered and lettered every compartment in a similar manner as on a Navy warship. We make a list of everything that comes on the boat, from every food item to tools, cooking implements, spare parts, to clothing and ground tackle. We know where everything is, and when we use it up, we annotate it on the list so we know what we still have on board. This is a picture of the boat in the Caribbean, fully provisioned. There's room for everything. It's one of the reasons I don't want to install unnecessary systems on the boat, because they take up valuable space which we need for the important stuff. Offshore, I seldom have the energy or desire to cook anything more than what I need to stay nourished, so it's generally easy to cook food for me. Eggs, toast, ramen, sandwiches, kippers and crackers, rice, pancakes, fried potatoes. Did I mention ramen?
That's what I'm talking about.
I carry as much fruit and vegetables as I think I can eat before it spoils. All the usual suspects: apples and oranges, bananas, melons, celery, etc. When double handing, I eat a more complete meal since I'm more rested, and when eating with others is a social event. When single handing, eating's more about sustainment. We don't have refrigeration, though our ice box will keep ice for up to 15 days. I plan to experiment with a small 25-liter 12-volt fridge to determine if it proves worthwhile and if the energy requirement is sustainable given our small 12-volt system. We have water tankage for 90 gallons, plus we carry extra water bottles. I plan on a luxurious gallon a day per person, which covers eating, drinking, dishes, and bathing. We carry 2 medical books on board. Dr. Michael Balin's Your Offshore Doctor, who's a circumnavigator himself and wrote the book, especially for offshore sailors. The second book is the International Medical Guide for Ships. We carry a basic medical kit with all the normal first aid bandages and ointments. We added antibiotics, seasick meds, scopolamine, blood coagulants, second skin moist burn pads, splints, dental kits, and sutures. I've never had a serious injury, just minor cuts and wounds like you'd get at home. I had my right knee swell up badly one time, but it resolved itself after a day or so. The worst problem I've had, which could have been quite dangerous, is I had an outbreak of shingles on the voyage home in 2019. I had a bad case of it in college, but this did not develop much beyond what you see here, other than it extended around my back. I've since received the 2-dose shingles vaccine, which I highly recommend when you turn 50. We also have medical evacuation insurance as a member of the Diver Alert Network. It's a great program for which you don't even have to be a diver. The membership and evacuation insurance is only $60 a year. Voyaging is by all accounts a fairly healthy lifestyle. Probably the single biggest thing I do to protect myself and crew, other than having a strong, well-maintained boat, I always employ a preventer, as the boom is the #1 killer on an offshore boat. The next most important thing is to avoid having loose gear adrift that can become a tripping hazard. I also think keeping the decks clear of gear and limiting the amount of equipment we hang off our boats makes it less likely we'll get injured trying to move around this mostly unnecessary stuff. I carry all the spare parts I can imagine I'll ever need, from engine parts to spare shackles. I carry all my tools, including those for working on the engine and woodworking and fiberglass repair. In the morning, just before dawn, I check the horizon. If the sky's clear, I might take a round of star shots for a celestial fix. I rig the in-fed long wire antenna and tune my HF receiver to the weather forecast, which typically starts around 0600. I send my lat long via the Garmin inReach. I make coffee and listen to the weather. I usually record it on my phone so I can play it back later.
And Far Reach,
Then I tour the deck and look for anything out of the ordinary, but I always pay particular attention to the rig.
And 40 degrees north latitude and about 63 degrees west longitude. So you've made some really good progress. And the conditions you should expect.
Then I eat breakfast. If I took celestial shots that morning, I reduce them and plot them out. I usually eat lunch around 1200. For me, it's important to establish a routine so I can better synchronize my mental and physical self to the voyage. Then I read, sleep, watch the water, journal, fill out the log throughout the day. At 1700, I tour the deck again. At 1730, I send the lat log. I rig the antenna, I tune the radio, and listen to the evening weather at 1800. The winter voyage to the Virgin Islands can often be squally at night, so I reduce sail before dark, if not already reefed down, just in case we get hit by a squall or other weather event. I want to avoid any kind of rodeo in the dark. You only have to go through that one time to understand its importance. A winter passage has a lot more nighttime than a summer passage. After supper, I tune the single sideband radio for entertainment, such as the BBC or Voice of America. Typically, I plan for 2 hours of sleep at a time to create an opportunity for 90-minute sleep cycle. Every time I wake up, I scan the horizon for ships and weather and check the course and speed, which I note in the logbook. I make sail changes as required. For bathing, I usually use a washcloth and just wipe down. Sometimes I shower off in the sitz tub. Sailing upwind offshore, you're just going to get wet. You're going to spend a lot of time in foul weather gear in the early part of the voyage. So taking a shower and really trying to stay clean is kind of pointless. But a bird bath with warm water is easy and quick, and it helps me feel clean. Sailing downwind is a totally different experience. It's like you're on a different planet than on an upwind voyage. Land ho! That's Tortola, directly ahead. It's hard to see. It's kind of obscured in the clouds and the haze. Virgin Gorda. Tortola directly in front of us, and behind the mainsail is Joost van Dyke. We've got a double reef main up and staysail making about 7 knots. Beam reach. Winds are about 20, gusting 25. Watching the hump of Virgin Gorda rise up out of the ocean and appearing through the morning haze after weeks at sea is thrilling. I wish every sailor could experience it. Once I arrive in either the U.S. Virgin Islands or the British Virgin Islands, my first order of business is to get the boat settled and securely anchored. If you're coming from the U.S. and sailing into the U.S. VI, then you don't need to clear in. If you're making landfall into the BVI, or anywhere else for that matter, then you will need to clear in. It's not a difficult process. As soon as it's completed, I inspect the boat carefully and make a list of any required maintenance before I do anything else. I always take care of the boat first because it takes care of me. And then I begin a series of long, deep sleeps and better meals as I recover mentally and physically from the voyage, all the while enjoying the scented tropical breeze blowing through the boat. I can't wipe the smile off my face. For most sailors, the thought of an offshore voyage comes with a fair amount of anxiety. For sure, the winter voyage to the Virgin Islands is more intense than the civilized downwind voyage home, but it has its own rewards. It's a thrilling experience to see your homeland disappear in your wake while new lands are calling you to adventure from far over the horizon. And when you finally make landfall with the lush tropical mountains rising up out of the sea, it gives you an amazing sense of accomplishment. It's like the whole world beckons you and anything is possible. If you enjoyed this episode of Far Reach Voyages, let us know in the comments. Also, if you like and subscribe, it helps promote the video so others can enjoy it too. See you in the next episode. We know where everything is, and when we use it up, we mark and we know where everything is, and when we use it up, we make we know where everything is, and when we use it, we mark